for them, and let's send it.
Roger that. Well, good evening. We're talking all things squat this week. We're gonna go fast and quick through this. Hit the parts of the squat science lecture that we hope you picked up, or hit those if you didn't get a chance to watch it. And then we're gonna get into your squats. Got a whole bunch of back squats downloaded. So let's get rolling. Why do we care about the squat? We care about the squat because it's one of the most functional human movements ever that we need to do. Love this quote from Greg Glassman. The needs of an Olympic athlete and our grandparents differ by degree, not kind. One is looking for functional dominance, the other for functional competence. So whether you are looking to increase your squat strength, to improve your power clean because you're a CrossFitter, or you just need to be able to get up off the toilet without help, you need to be able to squat, whether you're 18 years old or 100 years old. Tons of quotes from Greg Glassman here that we're going to go through. At one end of the spectrum, the squat is an essential component of weightlifting and powerlifting. At the other end, essential to getting off the toilet seat, regardless of what the problem is. The answer is to squat. Somebody stole presentation mode from me. Patrick.
How does that always happen?
I don't know.
Feels like it should be harder to do that.
I agree. It'd be really bizarre if somebody was looking at something they weren't supposed to be.
Right? How awkward.
All right, we're back. Some more quotes from Greg Glassman, and I think what's most profound about these quotes is that they're from way back in 2002 before anybody was talking about these. So there's a great short clip on YouTube that's super old, back when Greg Glassman had hair and a little bit less of a beer belly, but still wore jeans everywhere. He had a quote, "Just squat," and talking about the way we break down the squat into different pieces. He says no. CrossFit says no. I don't want to develop a culture of meta squatting, trying to figure out how to make people better perform different exercises so that they can then perform a squat. His stance, CrossFit stance, our stance is to just squat. If you want to get better at squatting, just squat. Great podcast episode 18.41 CrossFit podcast. Interviewed Greg Glassman and they asked him his thoughts on physical therapy, which is a little bit disappointing. He said, a physical therapist will tell you that you've been taking a dump wrong your whole life and then prescribe you 18 exercises before authorizing you to squat. And I think that's unfortunately fairly true, especially with those unfamiliar with the squat, those that still think the squat is dangerous. We see a lot of different isolation exercises to target leg strength, when if we really want to be targeting leg strength, especially if the patient or client has no pain, they should probably just be squatting. We're going to talk about different ways to get folks squatting right now. So we care about it from the fitness athlete side because you're going to see a lot of squats and squat patterns when dealing with these athletes. So you're going to see commonly across pretty much all sport, all different types of fitness, you're going to see the back squat and the front squat and maybe the overhead squat. And with that, you'll see the squat clean and squat snatch, which we'll touch on a little bit at the end of the course. You'll see different CrossFit specific movements, the thrusters. So we had dumbbell thrusters this week in the CrossFit Open, absolutely brutal exercise that requires a very good full depth squat, upright torso, all the points of performance for the squat we've talked about so far. We see the squat clean, the squat snatch, wall balls, box jumps, pistol squats, more, tons of squatting in CrossFit. Are deep squats safe? Let's see. This Hartman article is pretty foundational. We think of all the articles from this week. This is the one that you should know like the back of your hand. This is the one that you should maybe do an in-service on for your clinic. This is the one you should be talking about with your colleagues and with your patients. Print this article out, hand it out in front of the grocery store on Friday evening. Let everybody know about this article. It is very, very foundational. It tells us that deep squats do not contribute any increased risk of injury to passive tissue, and that it's actually a protective exercise that helps strengthen the lower extremity and all the ligaments and load-bearing tissues of the knee. We know that as the knee approaches 90 degrees of flexion, compression forces are the highest. But what we actually know is that once we get below 90 degrees, there's a wrapping effect that occurs, and deep squats actually become less injurious on the knee than above 90 degrees of flexion. And so Hartman and colleagues recommend that the half squat between 80 and 100 degrees of knee flexion cannot be recommended. So quarter squatting, half squatting is okay if the patient has pain. if they have something going on where we can't squat due to injury, due to pain, due to maybe post-op. But other than that, we need to be trying to achieve a full depth squat because we access those retropatellar complexes, and we also load them, and they're not loaded unless we're squatting below parallel. What about a lot of high volume squatting? Great study looking at Olympic weightlifters, folks who are doing different squat variations throughout their training week, doing front squats, back squats, overhead squats, cleans, snatches, different accessory work, squatting some sort of variation pretty much every day. Found that the injury incidence risk was lower than other sports like basketball, track and field, and gymnasts. Only 3.3 injuries per 1,000 training hours, which if you know anything about injury risk data, that's pretty darn good. Most importantly, of those injuries, 95% lasted 1 day or less. So they had a little knee problem, flared up, feeling a little buggy, took a day off, came back, able to get back to squatting. So 95% lasted 1 day or less. We know that squatting is not injurious to the meniscus or any retropatellar cartilage. Again, looking at professional weightlifters, finding that their cartilage is actually thicker, especially in the patella contact area, which makes sense. Cartilage is a load-bearing tissue. We have to load it to increase its thickness. So the more we squat, the more we load it, the thicker it gets, and overall increased mechanical stress tolerance. So this is just that Wolff's Law in effect again, use it or lose it. We know it's not dangerous to ligaments, the ACL or the PCL. We know that in a deep squat, the force just doesn't approach that to even challenge the ligament. At max of a 1.16 to 2.27 body weight squat, only challenges the ACL by about 41.5%, so not nearly the stress required to tear it. We know that as we get deeper in our squat, adductor magnus takes over as the primary hip extensor and produces the majority of the force of the hip extension moment to stand a squat up, especially from below parallel up to the sticking point about a quarter of the way up. The deeper we get, the wider we get, the more glute max and adductor magnus we have on board. When we do a lot of high volume squatting in the gym, some folks come up and say, my inner thigh is very sore, but not my quads or hamstrings, and that's how it should be. The squat is not primarily a rectus femoris or hamstring strengthening exercise. It's adductor magnus and glute exercise. Glute max kicks on above the sticking point all the way up to full extension. So to train glute max, squats are helpful. This study is kind of a no-dust study, but it's important to talk about. Training partial range of motion only makes you stronger in the range of motion that you train. If you deep squat, you get better at deep squats and shallow squats. If you only shallow squat, you only get better at a shallow squat. That should make a lot of sense to most of us. If you only do a 5-degree bicep curl, you will not expect to get stronger or bigger biceps in that limited range of motion. So poor translation from shallow squat from quarter or half squatting to a full depth squat. Fry and colleagues, really great article here, probably the second most important one this week next to Hartman and colleagues, just looking at what happens if we block the knee travel. So if we block the knees, that's an awful color. If we block the knees from going over the toes, what happens? Well, we do see a reduced knee force. So somebody with knee pain, maybe somebody post-op, maybe we don't want a lot of knee force, that's okay. But what we see is a terrible trade, increase in hip and low back torque of over 1,000%. So I think of my time as a student when I didn't know any better and told patients to not have their knees go over their toes, and they had back and hip pain with a back squat, and I was always confused about why that was. Well, now that I know this article, that makes a lot of sense. So if they don't have anything going on with their knee, let that knee go over that toe and sink to a full depth squat. Yes, a little bit more force on the knee, but way less force on the low back and hip overall. So we don't want to make this deal. Let that knee travel over those toes. Fry and colleagues conclude here, appropriate loading of all joints involved may require the knees to move past the toes. We know that Hartman and colleagues are not so nice. Their conclusion, again, why we love this paper, when talking about not allowing the knee to go over the toes, They conclude their paper, this evasive movement elicits greater anterior shear force on intervertebral discs and causes tensile forces on intervertebral ligaments, so it's going to put more force through your back. Instructions about a restriction of the forward knee displacement have to be strictly avoided. So unless otherwise indicated, don't block people's knees. Finally, they conclude very, very strongly, this recommendation is based on a misinterpretation of existing data and should be removed in future practical literature. So don't tell people to not let their knee go over their toes and stop researching it. It's a dead horse. These folks at the NSCA did not listen, and they researched it some more, but found the same exact thing. They reviewed 75 articles back in December of 2018 and found, based on currently available evidence, a full depth squat with a natural foot position, approximately shoulder width apart, with unrestricted anterior movement of the knees, an upright trunk, and a forward and upward gaze is recommended. So exactly how we teach it, exactly how CrossFit teaches it, exactly how most coaches teach it is how the squat should be taught, but definitely full depth and knee going over the toes whenever possible. I'm going to jump into some ways to get folks squatting in the clinic tomorrow, but if you all have questions on squat science, jump in here, type it out, shout it out, but I'll keep rolling on otherwise. So clinically, a lot of different ways to get people squatting in the clinic. A lot of ways to implement the squat pattern, both loaded and unloaded. I'm going to mute whoever that is. Okay. Good for patients and athletes who are new to squatting, who maybe have pain with squatting and we need to find an alternative, or who are just looking to improve their performance. The easiest way, the way that most of you are probably familiar with, is a goblet squat. So holding a kettlebell, a dumbbell, maybe a medicine ball or a D-ball high up on your chest, forces that upright trunk position. It can let the patient or athlete get a greater depth because of that upright trunk, and we can load the leg muscles pretty similar to a back squat. This is really good for folks who are having pain with back squats. For folks who are new to the squat, we can include a lot of different variations here. We can have folks do a goblet squat to a bench or a box just to get familiar with loading this pattern, holding some weight in their hands, and start to work their legs. With my older adults, this is my go-to, is a kettlebell goblet squat, and keeping the load light and working on tempo, which we'll talk about here in a second. Finally, this is just a great way to warm up your squat if you're about to start squatting in the gym. Great way to sink into your hips and warm up your muscles before you start squatting. The Spanish squat, band around the knees, really helps reduce knee force and help folks sink to a full depth squat, especially if they're having anterior knee pain. Folks with maybe patellofemoral pain syndrome, this is a really good way to get them squatting even while they're having active pain with squatting because of the reduced compression on the knee. We can also put it around the hips like this guy here and just offload some of your body weight and make the squat easier, make it easier to sink into a squat for somebody that's maybe not dealing with knee pain but just needs to move through the full range of motion of a squat. We can combine this with weight. Here's Zach doing a Spanish squat and a goblet squat combination together. So getting some load through the knee, offloading the knee a little bit, being able to work the full range of motion. With folks with knee pain with squatting, this is probably our number one go-to in the clinic is a kettlebell goblet squat with the Spanish squat variation. A lot of you are probably familiar with box squats. Really good to let folks know where the bottom of their squat is. So again, good for newer folks to the squat, folks who may have pain or fear around the squat as they know where that set endpoint is. We can play with the range of motion, keep folks in a pain-free range, or start to emphasize full depth squatting to a low box. We can have them sit all the way down and do a sit to stand. We can have them just touch their butt and work the isometric in the bottom, and then adjust that depth as they're able to. Again, we can do this with a barbell, we can do this with a kettlebell, we can do this with a dumbbell, we can do this unloaded and just add some tempo as well. Squat therapy is taught at the CrossFit L1 seminar is a way to kind of warm up and prime and teach the squat. So a lot of your CrossFit coaches that you may be working with or maybe looking to work with are very familiar with squat therapy. So we're just reinforcing that upright torso, starting with your hands arm's length away from the wall and trying to move as close as you can while maintaining an upright trunk in full depth. Really great to add tempo here as well and warm up your squat, or just have folks do some general leg strengthening without load by doing some tempo squat therapy. But a lot of your CrossFit coaches will be familiar with this. It's a great way to get folks squatting in the clinic, especially if you don't have access to a lot of load. So talked about tempo a lot. What is tempo? Tempo is controlling the eccentric time to lower the squat, the pause in the bottom, the isometric hold in the hole, the concentric time on the stand up, and then any sort of pause on the top. So you may see some lifts. It doesn't have to be squats, can be any sort of lift. But if you see a back squat that's prescribed 5x3, 225 pounds at 3010, that means we're taking 3 seconds to sit down into that squat. We're having no pause at the bottom. We're taking 1 second to stand up, so relatively instantaneous stand up, and then 0, no pause at the top. That looks very different than a tempo that is 3-3-1-0, which is 3 second eccentric, 3 second pause in the bottom, 1 second to stand up, and 0. So we can play with tempo to increase the load on a squat without increasing the weight at all and get a very different feel. A couple months ago, Mitch and I in our programming, we started a squat block where we started, I think, with 18-second eccentric tempo squats. And each week we went up in weight and down in the eccentric until we were at 0 eccentric. But 135-pound back squat at 18-second eccentric is pretty darn brutal. So without putting a lot of weight on the bar, you can get folks to really smoke their legs out by just playing with the tempo. It's really good too. Some folks may be pain-free under low load, but you still want to get a lot of work done. So instead of increasing their load to a point where they have symptoms, you can just play with the tempo and play with the eccentric, play with the isometric hold, play with the concentric stand-up as well, and really smoke their legs out and get a lot of strengthening done while keeping them asymptomatic or relatively asymptomatic. Last thing we'll talk about is this issue going on with knee valgus. What's happening in the squat with knees tracking inside of the toes? We know valgus is bad, but what does it look like with a heavy squat? If you follow CrossFitters or Olympic weightlifters on social media, you'll see on their heavy lifts, they have this valgus whip of their knees, and we see a lot of physical therapists and other healthcare and fitness professionals yelling at them for this knee valgus. So what is going on? Why is it happening to these folks who are lifting heavy weights and lifting heavy weights under fatigue? So remember that Vygotsky article that as depth increases, adductor magnus increases hip extension moment. Yes, good question. Colin says, is time under tension one of the biggest things to consider with mechanotransduction and loading? Yes, absolutely. It's why I would argue things like isometrics are the most beneficial, just getting that time under tension, inducing that chemical change in the tissue, which we don't get if we kind of rush through exercise super quick, especially exercise that's not challenging. So one of the biggest things I do is give a lot of time under tension with isometrics, even with folks who are relatively pain-free or have gotten out of the pain phase of their rehab. Like Mitch said, heavy, slow loading builds a lot of strength, keeps them asymptomatic, and makes them definitely more resilient, especially if you don't have access to heavier and heavier loads in the clinic. Time under tension with isometrics and eccentrics is the way to go. So that Vygotsky article, adductor magnus contributes to hip extension, especially as we get deeper and deeper and deeper, up to 50% of hip extension. So under heavy loads, we see this whip of bilateral knee valgus with things like heavy squats and cleans. What's happening there? That's adductor magnus contributing to hip extension during that sticking point of the squat. So as we hit the bottom of a squat and we start to stand up, we hit what we call the sticking point, and we need help to get out of that hole. We know glute max is shortened. Glute max can't help until we get above a quarter squat. We know hamstrings and quads are relatively useless throughout the range of motion of the squat. So what happens? Adductor magnus fires, whips those knees in a little bit, and then what we want to see is the person drive out right away into external rotation and stand up through the sticking point. This is a training adaptation. It's common and expected. So we are not coaching people to do this, but we're also not telling them not to do it. If we look at any high-performing athlete lifting a super heavy weight, lifting weight under fatigue. We will see this. Some of you demonstrated it this week in your videos when you're getting up to 80, 85, 90% of your 1 rep max. You showed a little bit of valgus whip, and that is okay. More research just came out last month. Again, just reinforcing that the squat is primarily an adductor magnus exercise, and then a little bit of a glute max exercise once we stand up out of the squat, finding that the volumes of adductor and glute max hypertrophy and strength significantly increased in full depth squats, and really not really rectus femoris or hamstring at all. So not really a quad or hamstring exercise, primarily adductor and glute. Yes, quads and hamstrings are active, but just not contributing a lot overall because of that hip extension moment as we get into a deep squat. So a quick video here. This is old Cody Anderson from the 2017 CrossFit Games. He's going to clean twice his body weight, and we're going to watch some valgus whip occur. So I'm going to turn my sound off. There it is. I'll try to capture it. Let's see. Hopefully everybody saw it. I don't know if I can grab it. So there's his bottom of the squat. So adductor magnus has to fire. There it is. So starts to whip into valgus, but almost immediately, if we go even 1 frame forward, as he stands up, there it is, and then he's driving out. So already in that short range of motion, he's already out of the valgus, driving out against it. Adductor magnus has fired, got him out of the bottom of the squat. Here he is, already past the sticking point, and then he's just going to stand it straight up, and he doesn't have knee pain. And so he's a 160-pound dude. He's a little guy, and he just cleaned 350 pounds, about 225% of his body weight, which is pretty darn impressive. So that's valgus whip, adductor whip in action. Common, expected training adaptation, not something that we are yelling at people about or trying to give them bands to push out against in their squat to correct, or different sort of lateral hip exercises to fix when it's that momentary bilateral motion that is controlled and they can show us that we can drive out against it. It's perfectly okay. So that's what we've got for squat science recap. What questions do you all have before we look at your squats?
Hey, Alan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So
What happened to Alan's mic?
Oh, I turned it
My,
off so you didn't hear the sound. Sorry, I just turned my sound back on.
okay. So my pain science brain kind of goes to, like the slow isometrics and the eccentrics, just that like consistent sensation, kind of changing the input from being a threatening input to a non-threatening input. Do you have any, I guess, thoughts on that? As well as the mechanotransduction as to why that helps so much with pain?
I think static holds, especially in a partial range of motion, just naturally appear less threatening. Especially you're not asking somebody to crank out reps. Just having somebody, I think of an exercise that I like to give, like a wall sit, unloaded, slide down the wall, hold right here, and then that's it. They can feel that they're exercising. Anybody that's ever done a long duration wall sit knows you start to sweat pretty darn quick, but it doesn't really feel like you're exercising. You're not really going through range of motion a bunch. I think isometrics are really good for that person who's afraid of movement, especially once they start to get that endorphin release and their pain goes down. That really helps create a lot of buy-in, and then you can jump to more active dynamic exercises. Other questions before we flip it to Mitch?
All right, I'm not going to waste any more time. If you got questions, shoot them in the comments or in the meantime. But this is what we're focusing on to start the night. Squat week, points of performance, points of focus for tonight's session. We are going to play a game. Let's play a game. It's called Spot the Flaw, and Alan is going to award points to the person who can comment, preferably with their microphone or with their keyboard, the fastest when we pull up a video and we're trying to spot the flaw. The quickest draw will get 10,000 points, and this game is where the points are made up and the score doesn't matter. So with that being said, let's try to be quick with it and try to identify this stuff in real time, because this is our second week looking at the squat. So it's not new material for you. You should be comfortable with good start positions. You should be comfortable with what's happening with the knee position. Are they hitting depth or not? All these other points of performance that we have on board. So this is where we're going to roll with this. All right, cool. The first video we have up is a very fancy edited video from Patrick. Sorry, I'm trying to get stuff minimized so I can see my screen. And I want to get this to the side view here. So we're going to let this play through, and I want to get it right over, let's say here. Okay, cool. This is the one good look that we kind of get at that. Patrick gives us a couple different views of some different weights, but this one we can see it the most. Let's go ahead and play 3, 2, 1, go. Spot the flaw. It was 2 reps. Who's got it? Audio is preferred. You're quicker with that. Mic up and shout it. Okay, nobody's commenting. Everyone's like, man, it's a really good, yay! Angel says, butt wink. If you didn't see it, that's okay, because it's a really minor one, right? It's very subtle and it's very right at the end range, and we only get it once we break parallel. Oh, just a little tuck of the butt under at the end range, and then we pull ourselves out of it. When we fast forward to the heavier loads, sometimes butt wink kind of makes itself disappear, right? As the weight on the bar works up, people up-regulate their midline stability. They kind of lock in. They get a little bit tighter in their squat position. But it's hard to tell because the angle on the squats kind of change a little bit, and so we're unable to see back position as we move forward. But this one we get just a little bit at the end range of the butt tucking under and then kind of pulling itself back out of that. If you can't see that, say I in the comments right now, just the letter I, if you can't see what we're talking about in terms of the butt wink. Okay, so we're all on board with that. Alan's going to award some fake bonus points to Angel for 10,000 to identifying that. But if we look at the front, we got a really solid squat here, right? We're being picky, we're being minute here. We've got a wider stance. I would consider this a wider stance squat, but notice that it's okay. Why? Because we maintain points of performance, and what those are: feet 0 to 10 degrees toed out. We're just slightly wider with the right toe. It looks like the right foot is a little bit more toed out than the left. Maybe a little bit more external rotation options with the right hip as opposed to the left hip, but I don't really care all that much because the knee is still tracking over the toe on both sides. He's able to reach depth, hip crease below the knee, and he's able to keep those knees stacked over the midfoot the whole time, right? So we don't see any change of position, so we're really, really happy with that. And he's able to maintain that throughout all 3 squats that we see, okay? So very, very solid job there. Very minor butt wink, and we're moving on to the second video, okay? I can click out of it anywhere, somewhere. Here we go. Moving to Lynn's video. Whoever here is squatting in jeans is quite impressive. I don't have any jeans that would allow me to squat that low. I need some stretchier denim to allow me to pull off what you see here.
They're stretchy pants.
Get this to pull up. Stretch pants. Okay, so walk forward, set your feet. Yeah. the jeans is the fault, right? Hip crease below the knee, foot position. Do we like it? Do we like it? What about the initiation? Do we break the hips and the knees at the same time? Right? That's what we should be looking for, right? Hips and the knees breaking almost simultaneously. I would say yes. Back angle, does it stay flat? Does it stay neutral the entire time? I would say yes. Hip crease below the knee, barely, but we get down there, right? If we have a look at this from the front, we can see a slight little change, a slight little asymmetry, if you will, from the front. Wish I had a faster internet. Having to load everything is really killing my style here tonight. Slight little change, slight little asymmetry there. What do you see? Not necessarily a fault, just something to notice, right? You should be able to see the angle of the tibia. What's the right tibia look like? Pretty vertical. What's the left tibia look like? Pretty knee out, right? Knee out over the outside of the foot, like on the 5th digit of the toe versus the second digit of the toe with the right knee, right? So you could, extrapolate. Maybe there's a little bit more midfoot mobility. Sorry, muted my microphone just in time to sneeze. You could extrapolate that maybe there's a little midfoot mobility allowance, more so on the left side than the right side. You could also be wondering if there's a hip mobility display, like asymmetry, right? Is there more external or internal rotation mobility on that left hip, allowing him to drive it out more than you see on the left hip, or on the right hip rather? So something worth noting and pointing out. You also want to ask, do we have pain with this, right? What's going on to cause that asymmetry? But nonetheless, if there's no pain and you can't pinpoint a mobility thing, then maybe it's just a motor control thing, where I would just come in and cue that right knee to be driven out a little bit harder, right? Right. So altogether, that's a very, very solid squat, a tough one, and that's why no one was commenting with comments there. Like, man, I just having a hard time seeing anything. Lewis video here, which I got mad respect for the barn gym. This looks super sweet to train in. Really appreciate that. Get that queued up. We answered some questions too about the glitchiness of the videos last week. Guys, we do the best we can to download these. We strip them off the internet and upload them to Google Drive. If it's really hard for you to watch the glitchiness on your end, just pull the videos up in real time on Facebook on your account. You can see what we're going through in the same video there. Start position. Do we start a brace neutral spine? I would say yes. Sorry, I missed the pause moment there. It happened kind of fast. Brace neutral spine, yep. I don't see a rib cage flare. I don't see a really overextended spine. Do the hips and the knees break at the same time? Yes, they do. But then the bar path kind of dips forward a little bit, right? Do you see that? You see that bar path? Look where the red dot at the end of the barbell is at now in relation to the squat rack. Now look how much closer it's going to track towards the squat rack, right? You see it kind of falling forward. It's tripping forward there, right? So what you want to be aware of is like what's causing the athlete to lean forward that much or to see that anterior bar path. Is it the forward dorsal lean? Or for this athlete, I'm thinking maybe it's just a little too much knee forward bending, right? Maybe it's just a little too much anterior translation of the knees, which is crazy because a lot of people don't do any of that at all. Remember, it's a shared breaking of the hips and the knees, so they're allowing the athlete to sit straight down. All things considered, I want a vertical bar path if they're doing that correctly, right? So for this athlete, I may cue a little bit more hips back, which I don't traditionally cue all that much, right? For a lot of folks, I'm not telling them to sit back. They're already doing too much of that. I'm telling them to push their knees forward. But for Lewis here, I'm going to cue a little bit more hips back to try to get that bar path to run a little bit straighter, a little bit more true over the midfoot instead of trending towards the toes here, right? I can't tell if the heels are lifting or not, but I can promise you that all the weight right now is on the toes and on the ball of the foot, like clenching into the earth, trying to keep them upright, which is not where you want to be under a heavy back squat. You want to be very well balanced in the midfoot. When you get to end range, feel like you can sit there and hold that position, not feel like you're like on your toes and fighting with plantar flexors to try to keep yourself upright, right? So little anterior bar path there with a slight cue of sitting back just a bit more, But all things considered, hip crease below the knee, back is flat. Everything else there on board is very, very solid, right? So a slight cue of motor control or engagement rather to straighten that one out, right? Okay, making great time because I have a lot of videos queued up. The next one is Lindsay's video. I'm going to let it play through, and I'm going to let you guys comment again on this one. And I will stay quiet until we get our first comment. So fair warning, if you don't like the awkward silence, be the first one to break the ice. That'll help. Jump forward until Lindsay walks this out. Okay, here we go. Back squat. First one to say it. Okay, a lot of submissions on butt wink, and I'm not going to deny that, but I'm going to get to that. I think there's something we can address that will lead us to what's causing the change in low back position, because I think a lot of us are seeing a change in low back position. Yes, we've got some start position stuff rolling in the back two extended overextension, and this was put in the comments as well by Lindsay of like, hey, what do you guys think of my start position? Like, do you think I'm a little overextended? And the big tell that you get here is the t-shirt, right? And yes, these are flowy tanks and they have a natural sit tendency to kind of be flowy in the front like that. But when the athletes are really overextended, a loose shirt will really help you kind of see that easier. You can see the anterior tilt of the pelvis, and you can see the rib cage flare a bit more as the front of the shirt kind of hangs out that way, right? So that's one tell. Now, the butt wink that we're all noticing is really the change of position from being overextended to neutral at the bottom. Because if I just froze that frame there, yes, that's a very low squat, right? That's very deep in the end range of the squat, but her back is not rounded there at end range. So what she did was move from a state of extension to a neutral state when she bottomed out that low, and then watch her as she pulls herself back into extension and on her way out of the squat, right? So this can still irritate the back, and this irritates itself more in like SI joint type pain for your like hypermobile, overextendy, lots of mobility type athletes, right? Athletes that used to be gymnasts, dancers, cheerleaders, have a lot of just genetic mobility. That extended start position feels like they're starting neutral, right? It feels to them like they are braced and solid, but in reality, they're just crushed in extension. And so when they move out of that overextended position into a neutral position at end range, can irritate the low back and SI joint, okay? Now, you'll also hear things like Lindsay says in her comments, like hip flexor pain or issues at the front of the hip. And a lot of them think that it's a hip flexion mobility issue, which Lindsay kind of put in the comments, like, I need to work on my hip flexion mobility. Although she has more hip flexion being displayed in her squat than anybody else's, right? If we look at the relative amount of hip flexion on board there, it's a lot, right? We don't need more hip flexion. What we likely need is a little motor control so that the athlete doesn't start in overextension and instead learns to pull their pelvis into a little bit more of a neutral position, pulls their rib cage down, and then can squat straight down without losing that rib cage pelvis alignment, right? So the best thing that we like for this is what Alan showed earlier, which is goblet squats. Why goblet squats? We'll think back to front squat week with that counterbalance out in front of you. It's much easier for you to maintain a neutral spinal alignment when you've got that counterbalance of that weight anterior to your center, as opposed to the bar being behind you and opening you up into overextension. So if I can get an athlete out of that hip pinch type pain, and I'm using a very hypothetical example. I'm not using Lindsay as an example because I don't know all the details of that for her. But if I have an athlete hypermobile, has this hip flexion related pain or an anterior hip pain, and I can get them in a kettlebell, teach them some pelvic rib cage alignment and get them to squat straight down in the squat. I'll ask them at the bottom, do you have hip pain when you do that? More times than not, they will report, no, it actually feels pretty good. So that to me is like the symptom modification technique. It's like, okay, did you see how that when we changed your pelvic position and your rib cage position and how you initiated the squat that your symptoms went away? Yes, that's very powerful information. What we need to do is extrapolate that to your back squat. It may take a couple weeks of you working with this with the front squat and everything, but we can get you out of pain without having to mobilize or stretch the hip at all. jumping to a different course a little bit here, but would this be also a common fault seen in pregnant and postpartum athletes? Yes, absolutely, Claire. Especially, pregnant athletes, when you've got all that anterior mass from the baby out in front and the hyperextension of the back, you'll see that a little bit more, especially when they're trying to still squat through the pregnancy. And then postpartum, just like a lack of like midline strength and engagement, right? Which is why we're pushing that so hard early on to kind of recapture a lot of that midline stability and strength to help with the overextension dominant stuff. Yeah, so no hip pain in Lindsay's case, but when screened for hip flexion, couldn't go into full hip flexion without is that pain? PPT? Pain pressure threshold? Is that what we got? Okay. Oh, posterior pelvic tilt. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so did you check that in just straight plain sagittal hip flexion, or did you also work it in like some like abduction external rotation like your squat pattern? I play around with that in like that kind of abducted externally rotate position that you're squatting in. It looks to me like you have plenty, and I get a little bit of pinch if I go straight plain sagittal, but if I'm allowed my hip to kind of flow out into the hip socket that it really likes to squat in, then I have no issue with the hip mobility. But it'd be interesting to play with. Cool, Lindsay, great video and great job jumping on with comments on that, guys. I'm gonna get to a couple more here. We've got Lawrence queued up next. I want to pull up Lawrence, and we'll bounce down to Courtney's next. We get Lauren's video queued up. We'll do the same thing. Have you guys shout out the first thing that you see with these back squats? Still nobody on the mic yet. Alan, an extra 10,000, so we're up to 20,000 for the first person to mic up on this one. If you don't think he's got a spreadsheet, he does, I promise.
Can I answer myself and get the points?
Yes, of course. Men will die for points.
Depth can improve.
Depth can improve. Kristen, good one there. Leads out of the squat with back extension. Alexander with a forward trunk lead at the bottom. Yep, got a lot of forward trunk lead, which is the first thing that I saw too, which is a lot of hips back, a lot of posterior hip translation, right? Which then I always look at like the knee relationship to the toe, and you don't see really the knee moving much past the toe. In fact, at this point, the knee is right at the end of the toe, and the heels are already starting to come up. So extrapolating potentially maybe some lack of dorsiflexion mobility, right? Makes sense because we got the toes rotated out, like Colin just said. And it also looks at this angle like the knee might be collapsing in slightly on the midfoot. So all things there would correlate with potential lack of dorsiflexion mobility. But nonetheless, we do have a lot of the hips back position and the forward torso. And then the next dynamic cue would be then, does they lead out of the squat with the back extension, which you noticed that she did, right?
Hey guys.
Go ahead.
That was me. So I had ACL surgery like 4 months ago with a patellar tendon graft. So on my left side. So I think a lot of it, and this is like, I've been squatting, but just on a Smith machine and doing a lot of like single leg work. So a lot of it I think is just like confidence with that. And like, I still do get that pulling. I didn't warm up at all. I did this like after work one day. So I wonder if like after warming up a little bit, cause it's still like super stiff, my patellar tendon until I get like a decent amount of warm up in. So
almost better to see it cold too, because then we can kind of see some of these angles. But obviously it makes a ton of sense why you see a real vertical knee when you're working with 4-month post-op ACL. So
yeah, it's just is stiff getting down that low still.
Totally. And something, I mean, our bias, my bias rather, is to jump to dorsiflexion, as I see that to be more and more the issue with folks. But also something like, hey, did you happen to have a knee ligament you surgically repaired?
Right. Yeah, and my dorsiflexion mobility is good, but I do get better control when I put the plates under my feet.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you for the comments. Adds context. Yeah, 100%. When you see an athlete that, because I do want to highlight, I forgot, Kristen. Yeah, Kristen made the comment of leading with back extension out of the squat. My biggest cue, I give a tactile cue there instead. I take my 2 fingers and I tap on the quads really hard. And I say at the bottom of the squat, I want you to use these and push yourself out with your legs because they are so used to using their back to try to pull them out of the squat. And I think that we might have potentially, I can't remember, potentially another video here that looks at like a very dominant back. It might be Kristen's herself. Let's see. Different Kristen. Different Kristen, but when we get to the bottom of this squat, you can see a lot of lumbar extension to initiate and pull out of the squat, right? Let me go back and freeze that one again. So good back angle, a little bit forward, but nonetheless a good back angle, right? Now, I always watch like the t-shirt. Watch the t-shirt in the back pull itself into extension and then like get some wrinkles in the t-shirt, right? That's how you know that the athlete went from like a flat back to pull themselves into extension. Some of this is athletes trying to stay tight in their back. Some of this is athletes who have the mobility pulling themselves into an extended position. Now, an extended position on a deadlift, maybe not that big of an issue. An extended position in a squat is a much bigger issue because we're axially loaded, right? So we've got spinal compression force on board. When we take the spine in any position outside of neutral, that has effects behind it, right? So we want to take the athlete and keep them as neutral as we can throughout the squat. And again, similar tactile cues there, fingers to the quads, poking on the quads, or I'll even give it, I'll put my hand on their low back and say, this is flat. Pause them in the bottom of the squat. This is flat. Okay, now don't pull with your back, push with your quads and try to keep your back flat. And for a lot of athletes, it's super, super hard because all they want to do is pull with their back. So with a really, really light weight, you can make them break a sweat. We do it all the time at our live course. If you've come to our live course, you've seen it happen with somebody that has a strong back or is used to dominating with their erector spine and pulling themselves out of the squat. I want this to be a leg movement. I want you to drive with your legs out of the squat, not pull with your back out of the squat. So use a little tactile cueing there to help them out, to get them out of that habit. Courtney's video from the front next, because Courtney does a good example of kind of that adductor whip a little bit, but also the immediate reversal or the driving the knees out quickly, right? Using the whip under a heavy back squat. Again, guys, I just want to emphasize that this isn't something that's like, your coach isn't going to cue you. Your coach is not going to cue you to like whip your knees into valgus. That's your own body just innately doing what it does to try to stand the weight up, which is recruit anything that will help with hip extension. And the adductor is a big player in that, right? So you'll see Courtney's video here kind of whip a little bit and then a quick reversal and drives her knees right back out again, which is exactly how we would cue it, right? Nothing else needs to be said. Nothing else needs to be done with this athlete. No R&T technique, no bands need to be added. The athlete is doing therapist losing their mind on Facebook when they see an athlete very, very strong squatting and they have a slight adductor whip like that and they got an immediate reversal like that. And these PTs sound off like they know what they're talking about. And, oh my gosh, it's just so hard to look at in the knees. This is healthy for the knees. This is fine for the knees. And these are actually really strong knees. Like your knees should look like this. This is how they should move as well, right? Notice that when she hits depth, the knee is still over the foot. So we don't have an uncontrolled valgus, right? Like she's like not falling into the squat. The knees are inside the midfoot as she's at the bottom. This is as she begins initiating out, a bilateral whip of the knees, and then an immediate correction and drives her knees back out, right? Beautifully done, Courtney. Just wanted to bring that point up and show that video. I want to take one more video and then have a few minutes available for questions. Let's do Tanya's. Pull this up here. Oh, special thanks to everyone who, well, first got themselves to a gym and got a barbell on their back, but also those that went a little heavier this week, right? Like did a light front squat last week and then put some weight on the bar for us and showed us a heavier back squat. So I want to thank you for that, because you start to see things like Courtney's, adductor rip a little bit that you wouldn't see with just an empty barbell, right? So appreciate you guys that are putting a little external load on board and seeing what technique does under that load. And even those of you that are 4 months fresh ACL and ice cold, showing us some fresh reps as well. That's all helpful information to see. So looking at Tanya's video here, I want you to focus on the yellow dot on the end of the barbell. Zoom in on the yellow dot on the end of the barbell. It's tracking bar path, right? So what did it do? It started behind the squat rack. It finished in front of the squat rack, and then it stands up tall and then resettles itself back, right? So yeah, we got some torso lean there. We've got the right foot turned out slightly. And we've got some wobbliness. Yeah, Lindsay, good point. Good pickup on like the shakiness a little bit there, like at end range. It just doesn't look super stable. And if we saw the anterior view, it would look the same too. You would see that little bit of, right at the end range, you would see like a little wobble there. A lot of that just has to do with comfort, right? Comfort at end range, comfort with a bar in your back, just sitting and isometrically holding the squat, right? Where a pause squat would really come into benefit there. Slow the athlete down, get them to end range, and have them count for 3 seconds before they stand up, right? So if I saw this with one of my athletes that's new, like relatively newer to the back squat, I would have them doing some pause squats before I added any external load, just so that they got comfortable with it. And again, to that time under tension point, you're going to build strength by doing some pause squats like that. And this is another athlete like we saw earlier too, where I would cue a little bit more posterior weight shift. Even though she's doing a good job of driving her knees forward like we cue, we're getting a little bit too much on the balls of our feet, and the bar path is starting to indicate that we're kind of falling forward. So I want to neutralize that a little bit. I want a straight bar path. Let's try to get a little bit more hips back out of that and see if the athlete can't get a little bit more comfortable at end range. Altogether, really good job of slowing herself down intuitively, of like trying to get comfortable with the lift. Just add a little pause there at end range, and I think you'll be able to get comfortable with this much quicker. Cool. Okay. On that note, I want to leave at least a couple minutes to ask and answer questions here. So who's got the first question of the night? Back squat or front squat related?
And not necessarily like technique, but I was curious when y'all would bring out like weightlifting belts. Like if there was a percentage or volume that you tended to use those with.
Good question, Cody. Yeah, the percentage is heavy, and that's, I don't know, man, north of 75, 80% on the bar. If you've got true 1 rep maxes and you're doing some strength training at like 80, 85, 90% of your 1 rep max, I have no problem breaking out the belt. For most lifting in Metcons, like a squat inside of a workout, I don't use a belt for, but I do typically use a belt for squat strength work, right? Percentage-based work above 75%. So I will use that, and just keep a note, like we talked about in our lecture, like understand how to brace appropriately. The belt is fine if your athlete knows how to breathe and brace. If the athlete doesn't know how to breathe and brace, and they just slap a belt around, like you're not going to become a superhero. Like you don't turn into Iron Man just because you put a Harbinger weightlifting belt on, right? So understand how to breathe and pressurize your midline, and then the belt just simply helps you pressurize and stabilize better, right? So yeah, anything over 75%, I'll typically break one out if I'm doing some strength training.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. And then Luke says high bar versus low bar. When would you mix these variations? For our applications in CrossFit, we pretty much steer clear of the low bar squat. One, it induces a much more aggressive forward torso lean, reduces depth. It doesn't translate itself very well to the other movements that we want to do, i.e. an upright torso. We're trying to keep a really erect upright torso with really sound hip function that's going to extrapolate itself to being able to overhead squat, snatch, and clean. And a low bar squat is going to encourage athletes to fold over much more. When would you see a low bar squat? It's pretty much specific to powerlifting, and I'm seeing its way work more and more into just like recreational fitnessers who are being told by a trainer or a coach that, hey, you should low bar squat. It's, I don't know, quote unquote easier. I don't know if that really is sound advice. I think there's certain folks with certain body types that may benefit more from a low bar squat, but you really got to ask yourself if the juice is worth the squeeze there. Like you're gonna put a bunch more stress on your hip flexion, like on your anterior hip and your low back, right? There's a lot more anterior lean or forward torso lean and anterior shear force that's going on in the low back. And you see a lot of folks work themselves into like some hip impingement symptoms because they've been low bar squatting long enough. That if you could take them to a high bar squat, they would work themselves out of that stuff. So I'm just not a huge advocate for it. It's specific to the powerlifting scene. You see a lot of folks doing it to squat big weight. But outside of that, I really don't encourage it much for my folks, general population wise. Other questions? We got 3 minutes. Okay, very good job. Good engagement tonight, guys. Whoops, I don't know why I muted. And great video work this week of getting your back squats in. Next week, we're on to the deadlift. So we're picking heavy stuff up off the ground, which is one of our favorite weeks. We are going to be keen on your setup position. So please, please, please watch the videos on the deadlift and the setup position before you go to the gym and just do some deadlifts, because otherwise you'll do the wrong thing. And we'll be like, didn't you watch the videos? And you'll be like, no, I shot my video before I watched the video. So just do us a favor, watch the video first, then go work on your setup position. We're going to be hitting it heavy on your start position. I want us all to be very comfortable with that at the end of next week's lecture. Alan, hit them with what that lecture material is with deadlift science, and then let's send these guys out of here.
Well, you kind of spoiled it. It's deadlift science. All the research behind using deadlifts for low back pain, deadlifts for core strengthening, different ways to get folks deadlifting in the clinic, much like this week's lecture about getting folks squatting in the clinic.
Hopefully after next week's lecture, you guys will be running into the clinic and like can't wait to just throw deadlifts on people. That's the goal. Hopefully you guys have been throwing squats at people. If you like, like Judy's in the clinic, she's like, geez, Cody, like, why am I squatting so much today? Like, what is going on? You're like, everyone needs a squat. You get a squat. You get a squat. And that's how we change physical therapy. One movement at a time. So very excited for next week. Get out there, continue working on your squat technique, continue loading it up and getting stronger. If you PR, we take full credit and responsibility for that. So you're welcome. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing some heavy deadlifts next week, guys. Get out of here. Have a great week, and we'll see you back same place, same time next week. Take care.
Bye, everybody. Have a good week. Looking forward to your videos. If you have questions, throw them in the Facebook group. Please tag us. We'll answer them.